Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Student Agencies podcast. Today's guest is Jeff Birnbaum, Director of Mobile Apps Partnership at Google. Jeff is a Cornell and Student Agencies alum who has spent over 2 decades building partnerships across digital media and technology, with roles at Google, DoubleClick, and Turner Sports. Much of his career has focused on influencing outcomes without formal authority, navigating shifting incentives, and operating in complex stakeholder-driven environments. In this conversation, we discuss early customer-facing responsibility, partnerships, and how strong judgment develops in fast-moving, ambiguous settings. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time.
No, my pleasure. Look forward to the conversation.
Perfect. So I'll kick us off with the first question. Um, you know, how, let's go back to your time at Cornell, right? When you were there, when you were studying, what were you studying, and kind of how did student agencies kind of fit into that experience, being a Cornellian?
Sure. I was in the College of Human Ecology, and my major at the time, I know these shift, over the decades, but it was policy analysis and management, with a consumer economics concentration. So that had a healthy dose of marketing. The policy analysis piece was a little bit of government combined with business and management, and I kind of like those, two disciplines. So student agencies, for me was a perfect place to actually apply business, right? Like taking things out of the textbook, out of the classroom, and like seeing and understanding how kind of business, ran and launched, and everything from kind of top down, from the balance sheets, because student agencies was its own independent corporation, just kind of, intrigued me. I didn't kind of get in on the management side of that, but like bringing kind of concepts and balance sheets and things that you were learning in the classroom, like to life in the, real world was, I think, kind of the first, attraction to student agencies. And also, as a college student, it paid as well. I want to ignore the fact that like I needed, money to, go out on the weekends or take some trips with my buddies, to visit others and all that. So, I got my start just kind of working for Big Red Shipping and Storage, just kind of doing moves, for an hourly rate. And, I think like any job, right, you got to start somewhere, right? So lifting boxes, was the start. And, I'm thrilled over 3-4 years it evolved into, several kind of, different businesses that we'll talk about today.
For sure. So you said you did bigger shipping and storage. Could you talk about kind of your progression through SAI and what else you kind of did during your time here?
Yeah, my kind of first, leadership, I guess, role, was more in the campus promotions group. And the campus, promotions group, at the time, there were really two products that I, recall that I worked on. One was kind of a coupon book. The actual kind of, title of it, is escaping me. But, it was discounts to, any and every business, in the area. Right. And that, really involved, pounding the pavement, right? It was kind of the first time that I ever kind of went, door to door, was picking up the phone and cold calling people, whether it was a pizza place, a laundromat, right? Like really ran the gamut of any service that, a student might need. We tried getting it, into that book, right? It was kind of like a flip book. You flipped around, you got the discounts, and, I think they were accessible obviously for free, but, we dropped them off in kind of, busy areas of the campus. And, that was, really pure sales. So that was kind of one business where I entered. There was another product at the time, which, I believe has been discontinued, called the Greek Directory, which we also placed, ads in, sometimes from the same companies, right? If you might have a discount, in the campus promotions, booklet, but then you also might get a quarter page, half page, full page ads in this Greek directory, which listed the phone numbers at the time of, people didn't have Snap or, however else they communicate, today, but, phone numbers, landlines, like physical landlines of people so that you could reach them and meet them kind of, after a party. So, it was interesting product because we were really able to do a lot of cross-selling, between the offerings, and there was other things within the campus promotion portfolio over time. So, that was, kind of first lesson I feel like in bringing like a suite of different products and, bundling things together and being able to negotiate, with these business owners.
What were some of
If I,
the sort of like challenging moments when you know pounding the pavement is a phrase that I hope is multi-generational. I know our generation knows what that means. What does pounding the pavement look like?
yeah.
Why is it something that you should do when you're roughly 20 years old? And how is it paid off today?
Yeah, great question. And when I think of the pound in the pavement piece, I actually it reminds me even further of there was a New York City version that I worked for. I don't know if we ever got it off the ground called Wall Street Bites. So we actually extended what we were doing on the campus promotion. This was with Dan Summer. He was already, I would guess, living in New York City, or part of the leadership team was in New York City, and they said, let's bring it to the city. And I remember it was either a spring break or, a fall break. Like we actually were on Wall Street going into New York City shop owners, right? So that was a big jump, right? Taking things from Ithaca to New York City. So when I really think about like both of those, right? The Ithaca piece prepared us for, the New York City piece, because you pop into a deli, or a gyro place, whatever it might be, down on Wall Street, they're pretty busy, right? So like, the pounding the pavement phrase is important because you're gonna get no more often than you're gonna get yes, right? And like hearing no and getting someone to yes, right? Because I think most business owners kind of, for these smaller businesses, they run pretty lean margins, right? So they start with no. So, really important lessons in trying to get people, to yes, and, building up, a pipeline, right? I don't think thought of it as a pipeline now, but kind of in my role, now I have a 2 o'clock meeting today, for pipeline management. We call it velocity, across our entire America's organization. And, that pipeline needs to be diligently manage and have different stages. And, we weren't anywhere near the level of sophistication, of course, that we have at Google now, but, it was probably scribbled notes, right? But first element of like building a pipeline, hearing no, trying to get people to yes, and, realizing that oftentimes success in business, like if you're batting, 100, right? 1 out of 10, that win rate might be okay as long as you get the volume up.
Right, right. Absolutely. And so you're noticing basically that well, would you say it's a fair characterization that in some fashion or another in every role that you've had to create and manage a pipeline?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I started in sales. Like my first job was a business development sales role at Turner Broadcasting. It was first in the CNN division and then the sports division, as you mentioned. And, I was doing pipeline management for the more senior sales teams, right? Like, and, that was something, you realize kind of in early career roles, that you want the salespeople to be selling, right? And, as a kind of core function and, managing a pipeline, it's, a critical skill and, something that a lot of people will, not have as their first priority when they're trying to close deals. But, the management and leadership, is extremely reliant, on those numbers and stages of opportunities in order to make decisions about the future of the business, in order to do forecasting, in order to set targets, right? We weren't, again, doing that level of sophistication, but, I think that first example of kind of just having that book of business, here's the 50 you're assigned to go after, right? And working down the line, it kind of led to kind of a broader understanding, of the why is this important, which I, practice now, on a daily and weekly basis.
Right. Sell or starve, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Especially when you're talking about, most of our clients were food clients,
Yeah.
right? So if you could also get, a free slice of pizza or a free sandwich, when you're a college student, like kind of out of the discussion, that, wasn't, a terrible outcome either, even if you got to know.
Yeah. Yeah,
You want the
I wonder how the management of pipelines across your career has led or informed any sorts of product decisions or product modifications or product roadmaps. And did that ever show up at student agencies, like where several conversations or numerous conversations during the management and creation of your pipeline then led to how do we change the directory? How do we change the map? And then how has that progressed? What does that look like in the rest of your career?
Yeah, I think I was even during the time that I was at student agencies, like the portfolio of offerings that we had within campus promotion was evolving and growing. Went from like just the booklet to adding on, this kind of Greek directory, piece of things. And then there was a flyers, business kind of posting flyers kind of, on campus, right? So I think, the more we kind of talk to different business owners and like realize their objectives, like, I think it gave us awareness for like how could we extend, their offering that they had, and like take a look. Okay, they have, potentially $2,000 allocated, to marketing, right? How far could we make that go? Could we kind of, extend that to, a suite, of different offerings? And most sales roles, end up evolving kind of towards a portfolio sale, right? You kind of earn a customer, first, whether that's with a trial, whether that's kind of with, some sort of upfront discount to kind of get them, on board, and then, evolve them into kind of a more regular customer. And you have, that steady state business, to manage, over time. Your best and easiest customers to, our retention customers, right? New acquisition, is harder. That kind of very first deal, right? When I'm doing a mix in my career over the last, decade and a half plus at Google, I always like to tell my team when we sign someone new and we're trying to build, multi-million dollar partnerships up to 9 figures, with companies like Roblox and Uber and Pinterest, I always like to tell my team that first million is harder than the next 50. So, I think kind of getting that initial commitment, really kind of opens the door, to more over time. And we have a process, that we're managing right now where all of our pipeline, opportunities are marked, whether or not they have a product dependency. We use a lot, probably too many hashtags, in our pipeline management, but like hashtag PD, right? That's product dependency. Hashtag top op, right? This is kind of an op that we've identified across the organization as a top opportunity. And then, we know that needs to get a different set of services, a different level, of support. Maybe we are willing to extend a different discount. So I think, it all leads like having product dependencies or considering something, as a higher value opportunity for strategic regions, maybe not just financially, because that client could be a case study or a reference. It leads to segmenting your opportunities and prioritizing them, which then, helps you, hit your goals, because all pipelines are really about hitting, whether it's a quarterly target, an annual target, a stretch target. We have all those, right? So, you kind of work backwards, if you have a good pipeline in terms of here's my top line number, how am I going to hit that, from a bottoms up, perspective. Again, it's dependent a bit on the size of your opportunity. And, with student agencies, again, it was a scaled business, right? Like we were, trying to generate dozens of leads, and if the hit rate was low, that was okay. But we just had to have a path to kind of hitting our quarterly, or product level target, for the fall edition of the directory or the spring edition. We knew we wanted to hit X. So you had to come up with a plan as to like, okay, if I'm going to hit, this number, I need to probably generate 100 leads and have a win rate of, 15, 20%. And you kind of, set your time, the limited time you have, as a student who's out there, doing more, doing this both, yes, for funds, but also to try and help the corporation, be profitable, right? So I think it really helps you, prioritize your time and figure out how many hours ultimately am I going to need to, devote to this.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that's super relatable for really any business manager at student agencies. I think, hearing a lot of our past alums and recently, students recently finished their time being a manager. I think I hear a lot of, time management. I never really understood what that really meant until I worked at student agencies and had to do all these things while being a student, while being an athlete, while being whatever. So that's great to hear. Kind of want to touch on, you said obviously, you're trying to hit 15-20% hit rate. No, that's a 80-85% of not hitting. Um, do you have some stories, or is there a specific experience when you're working on the campus promotion maps or the Great Directory of maybe a sale not going very well, or kind of something that's stuck with you to this day?
Yeah, a lot of the sales kind of, didn't go well. If, and one of the things I think I learned was timing was really important. You have to put yourself in the mode of that business owner, right? Like if you walk in during the lunch rush, right, to a food place, like you're not going to get, the time of day, right? And that might have been kind of more convenient. And I remember like kind of, a line out the door, of, some of the establishments, we were working with, and you learn pretty quickly, like avoid the lunch rush, right? Even at the end of the day, I recall kind of working with one of the pizza, shops kind of, down on probably Dryden. And, if you came at the end of the day, that owner's exhausted. They have just put in like an extremely long day. Small business owners kind of work really long hours. So I certainly do kind of remember like tuning the approach, to address, these owners, kind of when they were opening up, or simply kind of ask if you were just starting off with a phone call, like what would be a good time, to come by, right? So like always trying to be accommodating to the customer, is, one of the biggest lessons kind of that I took away, from, the experience of pounding the pavement, is that you need to meet them on their own terms, and make the sale, make the timing convenient, for that business owner.
Absolutely. It said that's a lesson that I learned time and again doing sales. You have to map out when you're going to do your visits, when you're going to do your calls, and it ends up turning out that you have a surprisingly small window of time during the day to actually do these things. So, if you know that pizza shop owners are going to be opening roughly at 11, but they get there at 10, to do their prep work or whatever, it's like you got from 10 to 11:30 maybe to hit that guy and every other guy who looks like him in your pipeline,
Yep.
right? And then you don't get an opportunity until 2:30 in the afternoon, but then dinner rush is coming at 5. So you have that window in the
Yep.
afternoon. And so if you're lining up calls at those times, it's like you only have 4 or 5 hours a day. You better be like really focused when you're doing that. And like you said, that translates back into the volume game. That is, hey, if I need to hit 100,000 or 500,000 or a million in sales, like how many of these calls do I actually need to make? And then we walk that back to a conversion rate at some sort of value, and there's my sales goal, right? Um, so Jeff, why do you think that a student could or should, in today's world where everyone at Cornell, they want to go into big tech, like where you are right now, they want to go into investment banking, they want to go into consulting, why should they work at student agencies? What's it going to give them? How's it going to give them a leg up versus their competition, which is, the other Ivy League students that are out there and their fellow classmates at Cornell?
Yeah, I think ultimately what student agencies is going to provide, to a student, up front is, learning how to work with a diverse, set of people. It's, extremely different working on a group project kind of in a marketing class when all the other students kind of are, you know, your same age, they kind of have similar, in many cases, backgrounds, similar goals, as you talked about, regarding the industries kind of that they're trying, to enter and their overall kind of career, objectives. So getting out and being able to kind of, talk to, people that have, these different backgrounds and, learn about their goals and, what they're ultimately kind of trying to achieve, I think is like lesson, number one, and a lifelong lesson, that you can take away. Because at the end of the day, people buy from people. So like building relationships, is not something, that you can really learn, in a class, right? And as AI is kind of transforming kind of, the entire world and, many big tech consulting investment banks, those industries you mentioned, which a lot of Cornellians, want, to get into, I consider my relationship management skills and creating mutually beneficial partnerships kind of to be my superpower as to what, ultimately will not make, me and my team, obsolete, right? Because, even if you have the absolute best portal and ways to automate, your technology, in ways that, might make the need for kind of a salesperson or a relationship manager obsolete. Ultimately, there's still service elements, to kind of, any business, that you need, to embed, into, how you go about running, that business, right? So not only kind of just, developing the relationships, like learning kind of, the motivations of, the end customer, but also then managing those relationships over time so that they become customers that you can retain, upsell, and renew, in additional kind of versions or kind of cross-selling kind of into other products.
Awesome. And kind of to wrap us up, one last question for you. If you could go back and give your younger self at student agencies starting off one piece of advice, what would it be?
Yeah. I got into a bunch of different areas, right? Mentioned started off in big red shipping and storage, kind of more just as, a laborer. And then, evolved to work kind of in campus promotions. But, one of the other interesting businesses I ran was a DJ company that we had. It was called City Jams. And that business was extremely hectic because we were looking to do events in the evening, oftentimes showing up to, a fraternity house or a house party at, 9, 10 o'clock, going till, 1 in the morning. And, things tend to go wrong, during those hours in terms of businesses not running smoothly, people not showing up. So I think, the ultimate lesson, and I didn't really like running that business. It was just too high stress. It took away kind of from, free time that I wanted, for myself. But in, the big red shipping and storage business also was a super stressful business because, it was crunched into, oftentimes like a week or two at the beginning of the semester and a week or two, towards, the end of the semester. So, I think the lesson is like, try a lot of different things, in terms of different types of businesses that have different cycles and different patterns to figure out like what you like to do, and where kind of your skills, kind of match up best, to the businesses, themselves, right? So I'm glad I tried a few different businesses, but ultimately, I kind of ended up spending more of my time in the campus promotions area because I really enjoyed the sales process and got kind of personal satisfaction out of closing deals, and that kind of carried over. So I think definitely just try out a bunch of things that have kind of different rhythms to it to realize how that best complements your skill, your lifestyle, the time available that you have, because doing different things is going to kind of teach you what your strengths are.
So what I'm hearing you say, Jeff, is that you found the inspiration for your entire career at student agencies. That's what I'm hearing you say.
I think you could say that, right? It wasn't my very first job. My first job, first steady state job, kind of before college, was a soccer referee. I've kind of like handed that in these days to soccer parent, which was replaced by a coach. But that teaches you kind of interesting customer service skills in its own way, because you typically have angry customers. But like, yes, learning how to kind of deal with people, I think, was the biggest thing I took away from student agencies, and inspired me to always kind of want to work, with external customers.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Hey, Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. Wishing you all the best in your future endeavors. And please do stay in touch. You may get some outreach from students based on this. They'll probably find you on LinkedIn because they know you're at Google and things like that. But it's great to hear from an alum who derives so much value and inspiration from his time at student agencies. And so thank you so much for taking the time.
No, my pleasure. It's great to see you guys doing this and kind of, getting the word further kind of out to students, and, see, the organization and still flourishing kind of 30 years after I was involved.